Hi, my friend Jolly has joined to talk about the implications of the recent Saturn-Mars conjunction, and we are going to be exploring a few regions across the world, which includes Iran. So, thanks, Jolly.
Thanks for having me again, Ashwin. I appreciate it.
Um, yeah, so I'll just straight away share the screen and uh, once again shout out to Planet Dance. If you don't have a professional astrologist software and if you're not able to buy it now, I think Planet Dance will solve your purpose. So that's it. Jolly, can you see the screen? Like, I think now we have China.
Yes, we
Uh,
do.
but maybe since Iran is in the news, let's go ahead and just quickly look at the Aries Ingress of Iran,
That,
and
yeah.
and and then straight away go to the Saturn Mars conjunction of Iran, and then move on to other regions, maybe in reverse order.
Okay, that sounds good. I like that.
So yeah, I think it's the chart is just valid for 3 months because we have a cardinal rising um, for Aries ingress, and straight away we have drama because of the North Node, the conjunction of North Node and Mercury in Aries. So straight away it kind of indicates that Iran wants to send a very strong message, and it also has very intense and amplified impacts, not just for the moment, but also for very very long time. And anyway, I think all this is just my opinion. I don't know what you think, but whatever is happening now at this point is just the you know a precursor or a trailer for what might happen after a few years. But I think this is just the build up for the major conflicts that still is yet to come. And interestingly, we have no planets in angles except for Mercury, but Mercury is placed in its own bound in Peregrine, which makes Mercury the victor. And it is interesting. So the day ruler is Mercury, and our ruler is also Mercury.
Mercury,
So
very strong Mercury here, and it's
yeah,
also in its own joy.
yeah, the first house, and Mercury gains strength in the east, and Mercury is strong in the first house. So yeah, but Mercury rules the third house, Jolly. So third house in terms of I don't mean to go psychological with this, but third house directly indicates some kind of action, or maybe courage, or having courage to kind of uh, really involve in some action. So I think what Iran has done is maybe a statement. I don't know what this is because Mercury is also indicative of statement, communication. So they want
Yes,
to say something.
yes,
In the when this Israel Gaza conflict began, we all know that somewhere around December, I think, if I'm not wrong, the Muslim League nations came together in Riyadh, and I think 51 or 52 countries were participated in it, and they had a major discussion about how they were going to deal with the given situation. Obviously, Gaza. And they did not arrive at any real consensus that could be taken forward. But I think Iran was one nation there who wanted to kind of retaliate very strongly, not necessarily militarily, but at least in some way that would penalize Israel um, for their actions against Gaza or in Gaza. So I don't know, like, but it really it kind of seems like a follow up from whatever they had to say at that particular point of time in the conference with Muslim League nations, and now it seems like the third house ruler Mercury in its own house, sorry, in its own terms in Aries is taking shape, and Rahu and Mercury in Aries also indicates impulsiveness. So it doesn't necessarily mean that Iran is correct. Uh, but I think Iran has surely set something in motion that really cannot be undone anytime soon. And in our offline conversation, you had a really interesting thing to say about. the Saturn Venus conjunction in the 12th house. So I think you can just elaborate a little bit on the first house and also just kind of take away with Saturn Venus conjunction in Pisces.
Okay, thank you, Ashwin. I mean, I agree with what you're saying, you know, to a large extent, and I think that we can't also ignore that the domicile ruler of the first house is
Is in the
Mars in
11th.
the 11th.
Yeah.
And this is going to be alliances.
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of leadership that I think is coming through in the Iranian actions. Potentially, you might argue that, but
Yeah.
it's interesting to see that domicile ruler in the 11th house. And then we have, of course, the mutual reception between Jupiter and Venus,
Venus.
the benefics,
Yeah.
even though it's the 12th and the 2nd, there is a mutual reception there that's kind of, again, only a sextile, but still it is reinforcing the benefics in both those houses. With Venus and Saturn in the 12th in particular, I do see an interesting, let's say, juxtaposition between diplomacy and drawing lines in the sand, for example. I think, if Saturn is limits and boundaries, what Iran has done is essentially said, we also have a right to defense, according to the
Yeah.
Vienna Convention and Article 51, their sovereign territory was attacked, and therefore they are liable
Right.
to retaliate. Now, what's interesting here is some of the analysis I've read talks about how I think the retaliation was really well thought out. They sent, if I understood correctly, 300 slow drones. These drones would take approximately 5 to 6 hours to reach Israel. It
Right.
was an extremely well-targeted attack. It only targeted military installations, and as a result, there wasn't a single death.
Right.
The slowness of the operation gave Israel and its allies time to react. And obviously there was a scrambling of interception. What Iran gains from this is valuable intel on that exact thing. What is the plan to intercept, to react? How does Israel and its allies respond? And where are those responses coming from?
Yeah.
This is all really valuable data for Iran to have, and it kind of opens up the lay of the land in a way that would not have been previously seen.
That's amazing because it kind of leads us into another thing in terms of spies. So we can always uh, associate spies with the 12th house. So with the second ruler in the 12th house, with mutual exchange between Venus and Jupiter, Saturn is indicative of grammar or patterns, or whatever you want to kind of call it in terms of planning or uh, anything like that. And 12th house is also the house of war. So maybe it's kind of they're testing the ground before actually entering into a major conflict. So they want to know where they're getting into, but also kind of the statement that they want to make is that they are not really afraid of uh, uh, going head on against Israel. So and another interesting thing is that, like, Venus ruling the second house is placed in the 12th house, and the 12th ruler is placed in the second house. So it directly kind of brings the lord of expenses and the lord of finance. So it's and 12th house is war. So the maybe since these are benefics, so they're not just kind of investing in war. Maybe they're investing in some kind of spy work or some other diplomatic work that the world is not aware of as yet. So do you think that is a plausible delineation?
100%. I mean, I think that if you look at the exchange prior to the retaliation by Iran, I thought it was very interesting that actually so much of it was even reported in the news. And that was, for example, this idea that Iran had spoken to the US, had basically given them the heads up, we're going to retaliate here, maybe even gave them a some kind of outline, broad outline,
Yeah.
and said, please leave it there. This is what's
Right.
going to happen. You know, we got hit with a stick. We have to hit back with a stick. We will only use a stick. We're not using something bigger. It's just a
Right.
stick. And in response, we want you to do your utmost to de-escalate anything further. So
Right.
I think that's absolutely speaks to the astrology here, 100%.
Right. And another important thing is, as you mentioned, like the ruler of the rising sign is placed in the 11th house, which is good as accidental dignity, but Mars is also peregrine in Aquarius, so it doesn't really have dignity. And Mars is placed in Saturn's bounds, and there is no aspect or reception between Saturn and Mars. So Saturn is pretty much very, very weak, and probably it can also cause affliction to Venus in many ways. So I don't know how that is going to play out, but maybe since we already have this idea of impulsion with Rahu and Mars in Aries in the first house, and Mars also not having any reception, it uh, I kind of feel like it might be a little earlier than when they wanted to actually react or act upon this thing, because I'm really kind of not you know in 100% satisfaction with the strength of Mars, because Mars is surely peregrine. So it also kind of indicates where they might have some issues with allies. It's not necessarily the
I
agreement.
agree. No,
So
I agree. Actually, that's a really good point. Sorry to interrupt, Ashwin, but I agree with you because as I was even saying it, I was thinking, well, yeah, that's Mars in the 11th. It's separation,
yeah,
it's splitting, it's causing conflict
yeah,
within allies. And I think because it's peregrine, actually, it's showing how Iran is really walking this path alone.
yeah,
I don't think it actually has there's no broad consensus amongst the Muslim states in terms of how best to respond. So I think Iran's very much doing this on its own. The only thing I would say though is that I think that Venus is, quite powerful here in that it's in its exaltation and it's in its own decan. It's,
yeah.
before it's preceding Saturn, so it's technically overcoming. Um, that's one point. And then I don't know if you would consider this a contra antisha at
Yeah,
all,
you can check it. Like,
Well,
yeah,
I was thinking, if you look at Mercury, Saturn,
right.
it's just shy of 30 degrees really, but I think that could be having Mercury in contrantition with Saturn, there's something there about, let's say, Mercury making a statement, Saturn declarative, with gravitas, drawing a boundary, drawing a line, but also potentially putting it on the outside, putting it, separating it from the group.
I also think it is a passive long-term planning.
I love that. Yeah, I can see that for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, I absolutely, actually, very good point because Saturn is time. That's a very good point.
yeah. So one more thing is, I know it's a very wide square and it's probably out of the orb, but I think there should be something with Jupiter and Mars, because and Mars is in the house of immediate resources, and obviously Iran is struggling with its economic condition, and it kind of indicates Mars is conflict. So Mars in a really conflicting aspect with Jupiter in the second house probably indicates that, although, I mean, they got into this, I mean, they already set into motion, so they can't do anything about it now. But maybe Mars and Jupiter indicates that this is something that they don't want at this time, considering their economic situation, because Iran's economy has not been great, obviously. Um, So that is one thing that we need to notice. And one more thing is like it's very difficult for us to kind of not really talk about the moon.
Mm,
And moon
yes.
is peregrine as well, and moon rules the fourth house. So the moon is succeedent, but the planet ruling the fourth house in the fifth house, maybe it shows some kind of because fifth house trine from the ascendant, it indicates the you know the agreement of Iranian people with what is happening in on the ground as it is with Israel.
And fifth house is also risks. I'm a
Yeah,
I really I associate the fifth house with risks. And so I think it is really interesting that the moon is there. I think that there's an understanding that, as you said, this has come a bit sooner than they would have liked. They
yeah,
appreciate that this is a risk. After all, the moon is ruled by the sun in the first. So
yeah,
there's a real understanding, but it is a waxing moon. So I
right,
think there's a general sense, again, not wanting to go too much into the psychology, but a
sure,
general sense perhaps of some kind of hopefulness. I know people will, of course, describe the current Iranian regime as being authoritarian and,
yeah,
not necessarily supportive of its people. And I'm not going to argue that, but there is some separation between the domestic policies and the foreign policies. And in this
yeah,
particular case, when it comes to foreign policy, it seems like there's backing here for,
yeah. That's what I meant. Yeah, it's
but
but
with risk, but
it
with
looks like
risk.
obviously with risks because this entire uh, setup is based on a foundational problem called high risk because anything can happen. We never know. But one
Yeah.
thing that I saw based on the eclipses and other things is that this war is not limited to Gaza. It is, and I mentioned that it's going to extend beyond Gaza to other regions in the Middle East, and now it's already showed signs. And I wouldn't be surprised if it actually extends to North Africa as well, which is not the topic of today. But I just kind of put in the transit charts outside, which kind of gives another interesting
Mm.
perspective. We see that Mars has made its way into the 12th house of the Ingress chart, while Venus has already moved into the first house of Aries, and also very closely conjunct Rahu. While Mercury is retrograding back again, coming to Rahu. So this thing is really interesting. I'm trying to kind of put a wheel so that people will understand what we are talking. So
I love that. I think, isn't that interesting? Of course, having Venus and Aries, it's like it's a very proactive, very assertive diplomacy happening here.
yeah,
And insofar as Rahu Ketu are planets of illusion, you
yeah,
know,
Rahu is surely illusion.
and so there's perhaps an illusionary aspect in here somewhere. And then, as you said, Mercury retrograding back is also extremely interesting. And oh, I like that.
Yeah,
Yes.
the sun in the first house, ruler of the fifth house, in the first house in exaltation. So it looks like they're in a reasonably, uh, you know, uh, probably as we already discussed earlier, they probably got into this sooner than they expected, but maybe at this point, I think they kind of uh, they started something that's not possible to end anytime soon. But I think they really put the ball in Israel's court, and we already spoke about spy work, and it's not necessarily spy work. And as you mentioned, so they kind of understand where everything is there by sending these 200 missiles and drones. They exactly know the positions of these interceptors. It doesn't mean that it won't change, but they surely know, since they already tested the waters.
That's such a great phrase, tested the waters, because I think that's really what, it's calculated risk, really. And you do have the sun ruling the moon and fortune here. And so there's this in the fifth house. So there's this idea that, okay, how can we extract the best from
Yeah.
this situation, even though we're having to go earlier than we would like. Okay, let's test the waters in such a way that gives us maximum data in terms of what a response could look like. And I think what was also interesting was seeing how quickly, from what I understood, Jordan initially closed its airspace and then very quickly reopened its
Yeah, I think
airspace
within 7 hours, maybe. I'm not exactly sure.
for the Western powers to come in and help
Yeah.
intercept these drones. So some people are saying that King Abdullah wouldn't have done that unless the situation was really, it's really interesting reading the analysis. Some people say this was completely a face-saving move by Iran. It was to simply show the deterrence that you would expect in the Middle East. If one country hits another country with a stick, that other country is required to hit back with a stick.
Yeah.
But other people are saying, no, this is, as you said, maybe a step on a very slippery slope. And King Abdullah has he shown his cards too early? It's hard to know.
Yeah, I feel like he has kind of opened up a little too early and kind of
Yeah.
opened themselves up to major risk because uh so I was just looking at the seventh house perspective because seventh ruler Venus is actually very strong, which is indicative of direct enemies. So in this case, Israel and obviously the United States kind of are direct enemies for Iran, and they are strong and they're in the 12th house, which seems which kind of is indicative that Israel has probably taken a step without understanding the complete strength, although they have just made this entire um, thing in kind of probably to understand what is happening and what is the strength of Israel, but still it shows that Israel is very strong, and Iran is going to find it very difficult if this kind of escalates to further steps, especially given the fact that their economy is struggling and they're already spending a lot in military equipment. So it's not very easy for Iran anyway.
Yeah.
So and the Lord of the MC, which is indicative of the king, is also placed in the 12th house, which indicates some kind of uncertainty for sure. So maybe the enemies have him or something like that, or maybe they baited him to do that. So that is one thing. But again, we really uh, it's a very weak condition as far as the Lord of the MC goes, except that Saturn aspects the MC, but I don't think it really matters as much when the ruler of the king itself is pretty weak and peregrine in the 12th house.
Except that potentially you can say it is being somewhat bona fide by an exalted Venus.
Yeah, that's the only case.
So, I think there might potentially be something there. Also, what is interesting is that it looks like it's potentially in the terms of, let's see, it's 12. Oh, so is it
Venus.
13 degrees? Where's Saturn? Is it 12 or 13?
I think Venus rules the first 12, so I think it's in
Yeah,
Jupiter's terms.
so it's in Jupiter's terms. It's just gone into Jupiter's terms, hasn't it?
Yeah.
That's also, I think,
Yeah, and
lending it.
term ruler and the ruler of Pisces aspects Jupiter, so that's there.
So I think that interestingly, yes, on the surface, it's in the 12th house, and that we wouldn't read that as very auspicious, if you will. But there's other subtle mitigations that are coming in that are propping up the Iranian position, if you will. So
yeah, I don't think the leadership of Iran is at risk by any means, just because I never kind of conclude the leadership's risk unless the Lord of the MC is some way connected with the nodes. So I don't really see a risk, but I surely see impulsiveness and little bit of the shaky situation that they're finding themselves in, although they don't appear to kind of show it out, obviously. So
but what there can be no doubt given the weight of sanctions on Iran, there can be no doubt that, as you said, there's no comparison with any of the Western, OECD countries. It
Yes,
just cannot compare. So
right. So, Jolly, shall we move on to the Mars Saturn conjunction? I think we did in
originally
the.
said,
Sorry?
yeah, let's do it. We originally wanted to just look at
Yeah,
Mars Saturn, didn't we? But I'm
yeah,
glad we
yeah.
looked at this chart. I think it was worth looking at.
Yeah, I think it was good. So, like Saturn Mars conjunction, Capricorn rising, with Saturn in the third house. So Saturn, Mars in the third house don't really indicate a direct challenge for the household of the nation, because I think I'll look at that with the fourth house. But I think the ruler of the rising sign in the third house, obviously the house of courage and effort and initiative, it seems like there is some affliction for Saturn for sure because of its conjunction
Mm.
with Mars. And At this point, it kind of directly aligns with whatever we had to say about this Aries Ingress chart. And we see that there is some kind of impulsive action that is confirmed in Saturn Mars conjunction chart in the third house. So there, there surely is a quick, rash initiative that they should probably not have taken at this point. That's what I think, because um, I mean, let's go to the household and fourth house and the problem for Iranian people soon. But I just want to kind of try and decode what Saturn and Mars inherently mean here.
For me, just to interrupt you briefly, I see this as actually reluctance.
Right.
So and I'm not disagreeing completely in terms of impulsive action, but I think this was reluctant action. This was
Right.
action that they, as you pointed out earlier, would have preferred to have taken much later down the line as opposed to now. I
Right.
also think it's interesting that, if it's in the third house of communication, so to speak, it's what do we see here? We see a declaration of aggressive action, a declaration of protecting honor, a declaration of, um, doubling down on a belief structure, right? Because it's Pisces.
Yeah.
So, but then a reluctance to have to actually act on that belief structure at this present moment. That's how I would see it, but
Yeah. No, it kind of directly leads me to the 10th house with Ketu in the 10th house. So Ketu in the 10th house surely shakes the leadership for sure. So it was not really. I mean, we already discussed in Aries Ingress chart, the 10th ruler Saturn in the 12th house indicates uncertainty with some mitigation. But here it's again the 10th ruler Venus is placed in the 4th house in detriment, but Venus is in its own terms. But I think now the MC is in the nodal axis, which surely says that there is some kind of a problem that's certainly coming up because of the actions, and Rahu is in the 4th house. So this is going to have potentially some implications in the domestic situation of Iran as well. And I won't be surprised if it is going to affect the economic situation. So I, I mean, Iran is already a highly sanctioned nation, and nothing is going to change with further sanctions. But again, second ruler Saturn in the third house, conjunct Mars, uh, going cadent. Saturn being cadent as the ruler of the first house is really a big deal,
it's a
and it
drain.
it does indicate decline. There is no doubt about it.
I think that, for example, having to launch the attack the way they did was a drain on their resources, without a doubt.
Yes.
So I agree with you there. I do think it's quite interesting to see that. I know we're focusing on Saturn, Mars Saturn, but it is interesting to see the moon conjunct Jupiter there in the fifth house of
Yeah,
risk.
indicates the support of people.
And and then the support of the people. So there's a dichotomy happening here, and that this is illustrated by the Rahu Ketu axis in the 4th and 10th of having to balance domestic issues versus issues in the public stage, right?
Yeah, having to balance, but I think it is going to cause an inherent imbalance because the nodal axis is all about causing imbalance. And the Saturn-Mars conjunction is kind of very, very descriptive. I really agree with what you say in terms of having to balance. So that is really reflective in the chart. But the Sun is also exalted, and Sun is the ruler of the 8th house. And doesn't it indicate discomfort itself? And we don't want to have Sun in conjunction with Rahu. And Mercury rules the 6th house of services and military, and Mercury is also placed in the 4th house. So maybe they are preparing themselves for an attack internally, and there's going to be something that's probably violent, if not as major, but something is kind of happening, and Iran is basically preparing for that, given the fact that Mercury as the 6th ruler is placed in the 4th house, and probably they're kind of looking to kind of uh, strengthen their defense or something like that.
Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, because also Mercury is about to be reborn.
Yeah.
And it's about to be reborn as a morning star. So
Yeah.
I think it's, yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different ways we could parse that, really. But I do, going back to the Mars Saturn, I think it's also interesting because Saturn's the exaltation ruler of that
Yes.
Ketu. So again, that emphasis on showing a good front, and hiding the lack of balance or the imbalance that's happening as a result of that.
Yeah, in the domestic environment, that's what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay.
Without
So
a doubt. Like we said, I mean, this was a drain on their resources. This was not something that they wanted to do, but they felt forced to do for what, because of the deterrence and the agreement of how the Middle East functions. Again, that idea of, if you hit me with a stick, I'll hit you back with a stick. Not a gun, a stick. It has to be proportionate. And of course, people will argue that it wasn't proportionate or whatever they want to argue. The point is that this was a drain on their resources, that this was a drain on their ability to fight, to manage. It's an Akkadian house, as you said. On one hand, it's if we say Mars Saturn is misery, just as one word, bringing misery. Well, in this particular chart, it's an Akkadian house, so the misery is there, but it's not as impactful as it would be if it were in an angle.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with you. And it's actually good for malefics to be placed in the 3rd house from Jyotish perspective. So this is not an inherently bad chart, but I get a feeling that somehow the support for Iran is not as much as they would like, because of the 9th ruler being retrograde and peregrine in the 4th house. So maybe it's just they need to kind of build a little bit more support for their actions, that's what I'm thinking. Like they made a move and without kind of worrying about what are the implications of it. But maybe now they feel that the support from the rest of the Muslim League nations is not as explicit as they would have liked.
I would agree with that analysis 100%.
So can we move on, Jolly?
Yeah, let's try to look at the next one.
So for this I have to, I think this is Ukraine. So
yes.
Here, we like, again, we don't want to see the ruler of the rising sign in the 6th house, but it's in conjunction with a very dignified moon. That's one thing. But anyway, the lord of the rising sign in the 6th house, cadent house, again it shows decline, and 6th house is more weaker cadent. So It kind of indicates the weakness at this point. And here, Jolly, you mentioned about Saturn-Mars conjunction not being in an angle. And here we see the Saturn-Mars conjunction in the fourth house. It is angular.
Yeah.
And fourth house is domestic environment, household. And Saturn and Mars is kind of indicative of the decimation that's currently happening in Ukraine. I mean, it's almost non-stop uh, for almost 2 years. Uh,
Yeah.
it and the moon's position in the sixth house again in aspect with Saturn and Mars. I know some people won't agree with sextile being a challenging aspect, but still it is an aspect from two malefics, so it has to count for something. And we also see the nodal axis in the 511, so which again indicates draining of resources. Fifth house is resource, obviously they don't have any resources at this point. And 11th house, there is no gains. I mean, what is Ukraine exporting? So they are not exporting any refined oil or anything. It's just completely gone. So it shows depletion of resources. And now I think the sun's position in the fifth house and also Rahu's position indicates the the support from other countries, especially in terms of weapons, because sixth house of military with the moon in the sixth house, I think it kind of indicates at least support in terms of weapons from other Western nations for them to kind of stand their ground at least. Although we all want the war to end.
Mm-hmm. I think, isn't it interesting? I mean, we have again the 10th house ruler is in a sense a dying Mercury.
Yeah, it's all yeah, that's what.
And so it's really showing this and again, if we think about fifth house's risks, it's just interesting. It is a exalted sun, of course, but however we slice it and dice it, I think this is by virtue of having that Mars Saturn in an angular house at the bottom of the chart. Really, we're showing a not very happy chart, and
Yeah.
therefore not very favorable situation for Ukraine at the moment. Of course that things can change, but as this is describing things as they stand now, this is not happy. The people are depleted, they're tired, they're exhausted. The home front is not doing well. I think also seventh house can also be seen as diplomacy, can't it? The country's diplomatic efforts vis-a-vis other countries. I
Yeah.
think that's what Raphael's mundane astrology says.
Right, but I don't know because I've not used the seventh house as house or topic of diplomacy. I always go back to the ninth house. So, but I'm not saying it's wrong. Maybe it has something to it. And the ruler of the seventh house in the fourth house showing retrogression probably also indicates that even Russia is also not really 100% uh, in this war now. Even probably they're also looking for this to end, but it's just that the ego of not willing to just let it go is playing in their minds, so they're also looking for some
Compromise.
sorry.
Compromise. I
Yeah, they don't
mean,
want to compromise.
nobody wants to compromise. Yeah, yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that could be another signification for Mars Saturn, showing where there's no ability to compromise, maybe.
Yeah. And one more quick thing, Jolly, it just occurred to me now. So if seventh house is enemies and 10th house is the you know sorry, fourth house is the 10th from 7th, so it indicates the actions or government of Russia. And Saturn and Mars, maybe it also indicates some kind of challenges within the Russian government and administration, because I earlier did a video saying that there might be a downfall in Russian administration somewhere
Mhm.
down the line. uh, by we'll start seeing signs by the end of this year, and things will
Mhm.
really peak by the beginning or I mean, probably the end of first quarter or beginning of second quarter next year. So I think that could be one of those things. It just kind of occurred to me. I mean, I didn't really think of this.
I like that though. I like, of course, we should be looking at derived houses, and to see the fourth as 10th from the seventh, it does make a lot of sense, and it certainly speaks to the situation on the ground at the moment. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think the planetary hour kind of speaks somewhere, because Saturn is the planetary hour in the previous chart of Mars Saturn conjunction for Iran. Mars was the planetary hour. So it's kind of indicative of distress. And as you mentioned, Saturn Mars conjunction misery. And the exact word that medieval astrologers used is adversities.
That makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah.
So yeah, now again, I think there's not much change in the chart with Gaza, except for the rising sign shifting to the Mercury's bounds. I mean, the ascendant shifting to Mercury's bounds from Jupiter's bounds. And even here we have the Saturn-Mars conjunction in
In the
fourth
fourth.
house.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, very, very descriptive of the situation of Gaza at this point. And Jolly, again, if we use the same derived houses perspective, it doesn't it indicate the problems or precarious situation that Israel is now, since the entire global stage is kind of tightening the noose against Israel, although Joe Biden openly said that they have ironclad support for Israel.
But interestingly, I agree. It's, if we think about Mars and Saturn as the accelerator and the brake,
Yeah.
kind of being pressed at the same time, I really think that's what we're seeing. Because,
Yes.
for example, you have Joe Biden saying ironclad, agreement or promise to protect Israel, but then at the same time, they're making it very clear that now, they're praising Israel and saying, look at how well you protected yourself against this
Yeah.
Iranian attack.
Yeah.
You've
Now
done
you
so.
have to stop.
Now you have to stop. Exactly. And so that really is speaking to that Mars Saturn imagery, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really well put. I think that's brilliant. But again, we don't need to really explain what is happening at Gaza at this point. But I think it's very interesting to note that the MC is in the 11th house, as opposed to, I think it was in the 10th house.
It was in the 10th. It was actually
Yeah.
at the anaretic degree. I think it was 29 degrees
Yeah,
in
it is.
the,
Now it's in
there
the
you go. Yeah.
yeah 11th house, and the MC falls in the nodal axis. So, and I don't see Gaza as a separate territory, and it is very much part of Israel and Palestine. It's almost like separating Kashmir from India. So, I mean, it's a similar situation, right? If I'm not wrong. So, I think MC in the 11th house, and the ruler of MC, which is the significator of the king, is in the 5th house, and it's in detriment. So, it obviously Benjamin Netanyahu is in a very, very difficult situation on both the fronts. While everyone wants to, everyone wants him to stop this bombardment in Gaza. On the other hand, now Iran has already taken some action, and again the ball is in his court. So I think it's just the pressure from all corners, and he's kind of stuck with nowhere to go. And it's very, very indicative of in the chart as well, because on the one side we have Rahu, that is the nodal axis is obviously there. On the other hand, we have Saturn and Mars in the 4th house. So this enclosure and this Papakatri and all those things are kind of coming together to it's like people are kind of tightening against Israel.
I mean, I not disagreeing completely with what you're saying, but insofar as we also look at this as the leadership of Gaza, Hamas,
It is. That's right. Yeah.
and again, what we're seeing is this reluctant support, if that. I mean, I don't think Hamas is feeling particularly supported at the moment. I think that there is a lot of instability, again, shown by the South Node in the 11th house of alliances. There isn't the, again, groundswelling of support that the leadership needs. It's not there. It's not happening. It's not consistent. And
there is no leadership. That's the thing.
Again, it's in disarray. Much like and how interesting is that? Much like what we're seeing in Israel. They're mirror images of each other.
Exactly. So, and that's probably one of the reasons why I always kind of, for this entire region, I always kind of look at Benjamin Netanyahu as an authoritative leader. Authoritative not in the sense of dictatorship, but the leader who is actually elected by people and is eligible to be crowned as a king. While the others, it's basically like, I'm not saying whatever, I'm not taking any sides here, but I think leadership also kind of indicates the Israeli prime minister at some level, because the chart for Tel Aviv and Gaza is not really different. That's what I mean to say.
Yeah, no. That's a really good point. And I think with the, let's face it, at the end of the day, Netanyahu does not enjoy support within Israel. There is a growing, some people say it's a minority, but there's still a growing visible protest against his leadership, against his authority. And I think most analyses will, if you look at what they're saying, it's basically that for Netanyahu's survival, political survival, he has to have war. That's the only way he can continue in power. And I think, again, that's very well illustrated by seeing, the 10th house ruler in the 5th, basically coming out of Kazemi. Sorry, did I make a mistake earlier? That's come out of Kazemi. It's actually turning into an evening star, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Mercury is kind of going into sun, so diurnally
no,
speaking.
sorry. So it is going to become a morning star.
It's going to rise, but now it's retrograde. But in its motion, Mercury will rise before the sun. Anyway,
so
I mean, in this star it is not. I mean, in this chart it is not. But Mercury will rise as it progresses. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's fascinating that we're seeing this, as you said, because of the geography, really, the charts aren't hugely different. And that's because the situation perhaps on both sides is not hugely different. There is a feeling certainly within if you look at for example, what's happening with the IDF on the ground, there are complaints that the army is not working in a regimented fashion. They are not working in a way you would normally expect an army to act. And in fact, there has been a lot of when it doesn't take very much to dig into articles that speak about Israeli generals for the last decade saying that the Israeli, that the IDF is not prepared for war.
Right. So I don't know. Shall we move on to Washington or?
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay. Yeah. So now we Saturn and Mars in the 7th house of Pisces. So I think you already described offline that it's very, very indicative of the current situation. But Jolly, again, 8th house is very prominent, which indicates transformation, and Sun is part of the nodal axis in the 8th house. And the 10th ruler is also placed in the 8th house. So there is so much going on in America, which is kind of very, very descriptive in the chart. So do you want to just talk about this 7th house thing, like as you mentioned?
Well, I just think that if we do look, I believe it's Raphael's mundane astrology. And if I look at the 7th house, according to this Raphael book that I've been looking at, it says foreign affairs and relations with other powers, war and international disputes, and foreign trade. So, if we have
encapsulation of Saturn and Mars.
Exactly. If we have that conjunction there, we can see the difficult line that Washington, D.C. is walking right now with respect to all of those topics. There is
Yeah.
this dual nature of wanting to show power, but also wanting to be somewhat restrained. I
Right.
don't think the Biden White House wants to engage in conflict. I don't think that they want World War III. I think they want to do everything in their power to avoid that, but they still have to beat that drum and kind of, you know, show that they're the big man on the street. So I think that imagery is really apt for where it's falling.
Yeah, and probably seventh house also indicates the growing, uh, you know, or probably the reducing support for United States on the global platform, or the shift in the tilt or global world order, or whatever you may want to call it. But I think the Lord of the MC in the eighth house says a lot about the precarious situation that Biden is at this point of time. And Mercury is already dark and it's going to go even darker. And the sun, which is the natural indicator of administration, is also very close to the node. And eighth house is the house of death and also destruction and forceful transformation. So something is kind of happening in a very
Brewing.
forceful way that the Americans don't really like at this point.
Or that it's being hidden from them as well. I mean, I think, again, going back to the Raphael Mundane Astrology book, they say exactly as you said, in the book, death and destruction. They also mentioned the eighth house as the Privy Council.
Yeah,
And so I think that's really interesting, because if the Privy Council, I would assume, is going to be the senior leadership team that's, you know, supporting the president. And clearly there's a lot of back and forth happening behind the scenes. We do know that, for example, a lot of the State Department have been unhappy with how Biden has been handling the affairs in the Middle East.
yeah,
And so I think, again, there's a lot going on in the background that we're certainly not seeing
sure.
the whole.
And I think it's kind of indicative of like how they're showing their ironclad support, the ninth house. I always look at ninth house for foreign diplomacy, and a very strong moon along with Jupiter in the ninth house kind of shows that they, I mean, in one way, they don't want to kind of take off their support for Israel. But on the other hand, the ruler of the ninth house, that is Venus, is placed in the eighth house, and they're also facing backlash for all the problems that are kind of arising, and people kind of tend to think it's only because of the United States. So I think a lot of things kind of come out within this 7, 8, and ninth house. It's interesting.
And here's just one more piece.
Yeah,
This tickles me. I'd like to hear what you think. Again, according to Raphael's Mundane Astrology, the ninth house has to also do with shipping.
right. Yeah, export.
And so to have the ninth house ruler in exile in the eighth house, I think this is absolutely speaking to how the US tried to pull together this coalition to fight the Houthis. Uh,
Yeah,
and how that's fallen apart, and now they're trying to sue for some kind of agreement. So
that's
to
really
me,
brilliant, Jolly.
I think that is just so on point, where you have this embattled Venus in a dark house going, okay, right. We're clearly not winning this battle. We need to come to some kind of agreement.
Yeah, just a quick thing which again just stuck in my mind right now. Like, I always look at eighth house for oil, but I know that Tanya Daniel says that oil is also fourth house because it is the
Under the
underground.
ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you look at the Gaza chart, we have Saturn and Mars in the fourth house, and Mercury is retrograde. And Mercury is retrograde in all the, sorry, um, Mercury is retrograde in all Saturn-Mars conjunction charts, and Mercury is indicative of trade. So I'm just wondering if something is going to happen to bring all this entire military situation into a halt, because how plausible it is that the Middle East stops supplying oil to Israel and also other countries so that the war will be stopped. I think the same scenario happened in the early 70s.
Oh, yes. The OPEC oil crisis.
Yeah.
I remember living through that, and it was extraordinary. All of a sudden, everybody in the US, this is from a child's point of view, mind you, but I remember
Yeah.
in the US, you could drive on the highway at 70, 75 miles an hour, and all of a sudden, they dropped the speed limit to 55, I think it was 60 or 55,
Right.
in a bid to extend the range of cars because of the oil crisis. So yeah, that's a really good point, Ashwin. I like that.
I think something, but I always had this thought, Jolly. Probably that is one passive way of putting a halt to this entire war situation. But that depends on the OPEC, as you mentioned. So, shall we move, or do you have something to kind of
No,
add?
no,
Final
let's
thoughts?
look at the next one. This has been great so far. I'm having a lot of fun.
Yeah. Okay. UK. Like it's the. I mean, how interesting it is, because Rishi Sunak is almost kind of on the verge of decline. He's like a cat on the wall prime minister at this point, and the ruler of the MC 10th house is actually eclipsed and also cadent in the 6th house. Um, so yeah, it's very interesting. It just kind of directly stuck in my eyes, and yeah,
I think it's really interesting that you have this Mars Saturn conjunction in the
in the
fifth
5th
house,
house. Yeah,
where we can also, again, quoting the Raphael mundane astrology, is the house of morals
and also reserves.
and resources, but certainly
No, I mean
the
reserves.
oh, right.
Yeah.
But what I think is interesting from this kind of moral perspective is this idea that the current government has, I think they're only polling at 19%.
Ah.
And this is, which is, I think, a historic low for the conservatives. This could
Right.
be the death blow of the Conservative Party as we know it. That there's been a huge splinter group called the Reform Party that has taken a large chunk of the more right-leaning people within the Conservatives with them. But again, interestingly, there's been so much open corruption in Britain,
Right.
and this kind of understanding of asset stripping that has been happening from public good, public resources. And this has been also shown in an index that I know a lot of people have been arguing against. Nevertheless, there's an index that's released annually called the Trust Index. It's how much trust does the population put in their government. And the
Right.
UK again has reached a historic low. I can't remember the exact position, but it is a fact. I think that the average person on the street here in the UK does not trust the government that is currently in power. Sunak is hugely embattled. Nobody wants him there. He's seen as this
Yeah.
unelectable leader. So it is really interesting to see that fall where it is in the fifth house. And then also, as you said, to see the 10th house ruler in a cadent house being eclipsed.
Uh, that's amazing, because I think you in the UK can give better perspective than anyone else. So, just one thing, Jolly, like maybe this is a separate video itself, but I remember looking at the Jupiter Saturn conjunction of England, and I
Mm,
noticed that the the leadership is always going to be shaky for the next 20 years in England.
yeah.
Uh, so I will be surprised if any prime minister serves their entire uh, you know uh, tenure in the office, because I looked at Boris Johnson's spear bearing from his 7th and 10th house, and I openly wrote that I wouldn't be surprised if he goes out of office before his tenure. And it was surprising because he went off, like, and out of nowhere he almost went out of the office. And similar thing is happening with Liz. I mean, it happened with Liz Truss, I think. Just 1 month, or I don't remember
49
exactly.
days.
Yeah,
49.
okay, yeah, okay. One of the shortest tenure as prime minister. And then now Rishi Sunak. So it's so unfortunate that England is
It's
going
been
through.
it's been a literal washing machine of prime ministers. I mean, it's just so sad. It is so sad. It
Yeah,
really
no,
is.
it is. Yeah. So
Oh,
I think
yeah.
it's going to continue for the next 20 years. We'll see what happens. So,
Hmm.
like, Jolly, do you want to do some other regions, or we should just close here? Because I have Brazil and China here. But I don't know if we should do, or if we can just.
Let's just do, if you're okay for
Yeah,
time, let's just have a brief look
yeah,
at
I'm
those two
okay. Yeah.
charts. Yeah.
Okay. So I think it's interesting for Brazil because it shifts. I think it'll be good to kind of talk about this. Um,
Wow, look at that. Wow.
Yeah, Venus is in the 7th house. The Lord of the rising sign Venus and Lord of the MC is in the 8th house, but it's strong. So there is some kind of transformation. I'm not really closely following Brazil today as I do with Argentina, but I think the situation is again, they have a strong leader, but their situation is not so good, and they want much more. People kind of expect much more from their leader than what is just happening in reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. I was looking up just briefly before we got online together, and Brazil is the world's 12th largest economy. It
Yeah,
takes up 50% of the landmass of South America.
yeah.
A population of 203 million people. The article that I read today was about women uh looking for, because the abortion laws in Brazil are quite strict. I mean, it's technically not, it is technically a secular country, but it still is dominated by Catholicism. And
Right.
I just think it's interesting looking at, the moon and Jupiter conjunct there in the 8th house in Taurus. We can also look at, for example, the 5th house as meaning children and the birth rate, and the
Wow.
ruler Saturn is in the 6th and a cadent house. There's a lot of internal issue, and of course Saturn rules the
The fourth
4th.
house, obviously. Yeah.
So
Domestic
as you
issues.
said, I think with that exalted sun in the 7th house in terms of foreign affairs, Brazil is putting on a very good show. Lula is basically rattling, his whatever, and saying, this is where we're coming from in terms of foreign affairs, and he's putting on it sounds like he has some authority, but I think, as you point out, back home things are not as good as they could be, should be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the diplomatic situation is kind of coming back as much as they would like. Before it was like probably before 5 or 6 years. Now they're kind of openly dealing with a lot of things, and I think Brazil is one of the important forces that keeps the BRICS going because of this ongoing conflict between India and China. I think it's important for Brazil to kind of step up, and I think they've done it for the past 2 years really very well.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, I think that is a very good point that you made with Sun in the 7th house, and but it also indicates their uncertain, or maybe not uncertain, but a very um a territory that they're not used to. Like imagine like I am living in Siberia or something like that. I've been brought up in tropical conditions, so it's kind of like a very exiled kind of situation where they're finding themselves.
Well, and Aries is pioneering. It's breaking new ground.
Yeah,
So I think that it absolutely, the astrology absolutely supports what you're saying. I think it's interesting to see, obviously with Bolsonaro before, you had a completely different situation and a different way of engaging.
Yeah,
So, as you pointed out, Brazil being engaging in a thoughtful way, particularly within BRICS, is absolutely essential if BRICS is to continue in its growth and its influence. So
right.
yeah.
Great. China. I don't
Mm.
think the charts really change for China and Taiwan, but Saturn and Mars in the first house goes really well with destruction.
Well,
So
again, but we can also see that as that reluctance to act potentially,
yeah,
or
pretty much they are not acting.
I think they are, again, walking a very fine line. I think they
Yeah,
are trying to appear to be reasonable. They are trying to appear to be, on one hand, exerting power, but on the other hand, not going beyond what would seem to be conservative or restrained.
yeah,
So again, for me, that imagery does speak quite uh, well to what I think China is happening on the public stage. I mean, again, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've got if we look at the seventh house as foreign affairs, then you have the ruler Kazemi and about to be reborn as a morning star. But in this particular place, we can see that it's not doing so great.
yeah,
It's in the second house. I just think it's really interesting because in terms of the PR war, US is doing its best, and the UK and the other Western nations, to paint China as an enemy, right? The enemy
yeah,
is Russia and China.
yeah. Anyway,
Um,
like no matter what, yeah,
and I read I'm sorry, this is going a little bit off topic, but I read a really interesting article the other day about how, and nobody knows where India stands because nobody knows who is Modi actually being friendly to, not being friendly to. He's being friendly, I think, as much as possible with everyone.
yeah,
But because of that, nobody actually understands who is he perceiving as friend and who is he perceiving as foe.
yeah,
There's on one hand you could say that there's like a chameleon aspect to it, on another hand you could say there's a slippery aspect to it, but in so far as he is playing that foreign affairs game very well, I have to say, because
yeah,
nobody can pin him down. And
for sure.
here, I think in China, on the other hand, there has been this like global PR war that the enemy is China and Russia. And so I think this chart is showing how China's reputation maybe is about to change, but so far has been suffering.
And I think it's about to take a major hit because of Saturn and Mars in the first house, because it indicates the attitude and the reputation of the nation. And so I think, and the Lord of the MC is also placed in the third house, which again shows decline. Um,
Weakness. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I get a feeling that there is some kind of a major destruction in China that is about to happen uh, because of this Saturn Mars conjunction, because it's really precarious in the first house, Jolly. It's not easy, and both these
Oh,
planets don't have any dignity.
mhm.
So
No, absolutely. And we said that, if we try to really condense it, Mars Saturn is misery and it's in the first house of the country. So
yeah,
it's not a great place for it to be. And no, there's no two ways about it.
mm,
And the ascendant ruler and the 10th house ruler are both, is Jupiter, and
yeah,
that is in a cadent place. So it's very weak.
yes, yeah. I think that is uh, it's challenging time for the entire world, right? So we didn't see a single good chart that.
No, not really.
uh, and that is all about Saturn and Mars conjunction.
Yeah, exactly. You can't expect to see that with Mars Saturn because this is, you know, deliberately speaking to those challenges, right?
So yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground, and we might become notoriously famous for longer videos if we
Sorry.
are not little careful. But I think it was amazing.
Well, I really enjoyed this, Ashwin.
I,
Thank you so much.
yeah, no problem. It kind of looks like we didn't have much time, but we spent so much time. But we only kind of did snapshot analysis of so many charts, and if we have to really talk reasonably in detail about all these mundane charts, we need to spend at least half an hour per chart and see what is happening. But my primary objective is to kind of give an idea and also try to make a little educative for people who are new to astrology or mundane astrology. So I think from that perspective, I think it's amazing.
No, I really enjoyed this. Thanks again,
Thanks,
Ashwin.
Jolly. Thanks. And I think I hope to kind of do this regularly.
I would love to.